Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Syed Farhad and I am lecturer radiology at Professional College of Medical Sciences. And today the topic of my presentation is the anatomy of the large intestine. But we have already discussed the first part and the second part of the large intestine, which were the cecum and the appendix. So today we will start from the ascending colon. So ascending colon is about 5 inches in length, and it's about 13 centimeter long. Ascending colon lies, or it's present in the right lower quadrant of our abdominal cavity. Okay, the large intestine extends upward from the cecum. This is cecum. The large intestine extends upward from the cecum to the inferior surface of the right lobe of the liver. This is the inferior surface of the right lobe of the liver. So the cecum extend, so the ascending colon extend from the cecum to the inferior lobe or inferior surface of the right lobe of the liver, and here it turns to the left like this. It turns to the left and forms the right colic flexure. This is the right colic flexure. And the right colic flexure is also known as hepatic flexure. And from this point, it forms the transverse colon. The large intestine is covered by peritoneum in front and at sides. Sides and in front of the ascending colon is covered by peritoneum. Okay, now comes to the arterial supply, the venous supply, and the nervous supply of the ascending colon. So let's start from the arterial supply. The ileocolic artery ileocolic and right ileocolic arteries supply oxygenated blood to the ascending colon, and these are the branches of superior mesenteric artery. Now comes to the venous supply. So the corresponding veins to the arteries, and it drains into the superior mesenteric vein, like the ileocolic and right colic vein drain deoxygenated blood from the ascending colon and carry it to the or drain into the superior mesenteric vein. Okay, now comes to the lymphatic drainage. So the nodes and the colic blood vessels reach finally into the superior mesenteric node. Okay, now comes to the nerve supply. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic vagus nerve, and it's from the superior mesenteric plexus. Okay, comes to the transverse mesocolon. What do you people mean by transverse mesocolon? So the transverse mesocolon are or the mesentery of the transverse colon suspends the transverse colon from the anterior border of the spleen. It suspends the transverse colon from the anterior border of the pancreas. So before going to start the transverse colon, you should know the transverse mesocolon. Okay, now let's start the next part of the Intestine, which is the transverse colon. The transverse colon is about 15 inches or 28 centimeter long. And it extends across the abdomen and it occupying the umbilical region. Okay, the transverse colon starts from the transverse colon starts from the right colic flexure or hepatic flexure and below to the right lobe of the liver, which is present in the right lobe of the liver, and it's hang down like this, suspended by the transverse mesocolon from the pancreas, and it then ascends to the left colic flexure. This is the left colic flexure, or we also call it the splenic flexure. Okay, the left colic flexure is higher than the right one. This one is higher than the right colic flexure, and it's suspended from the diaphragm by the phrenocoelic ligament. It is suspended by the diaphragm by the phrenocoelic ligament. Okay. Now comes to the arterial supply, the venous supply of the transverse colon. So the proximal proximal two-third of the transverse colon is supplied by middle colic artery. Middle colic artery, and middle colic artery is the branch of the superior mesenteric artery. Superior mesenteric artery, and the distal third of the transverse colon is supplied by the left colic artery. And it's also a branch of the superior mesenteric artery. Now comes to the venous supply. So the veins correspond to the arteries and drains into the inferior and superior mesenteric vein. Inferior and superior mesenteric vein. Lymph drainage. The proximal two-third drains into the colic nodes and then into the superior mesenteric node. And the distal third drains into the colic node and then into the inferior mesenteric node. Okay, the nerve supply. So the proximal two-third of the transverse colon is by sympathetic vagal nerve through superior mesenteric plexus, and the distal third is innervated by sympathetic and parasympathetic pelvic splenic nerve through inferior mesenteric plexus. So you should know the arterial supply, the venous supply, the lymph drainage, and the nerve supply of the transverse colon. Okay. Now comes to the descending colon. So the descending colon is about 10 inch or 25 centimeter long, and it lies in the left upper and left lower quadrant. Left upper and left lower quadrant. The descending colon extends downward from the left colic flexure to the pelvic brim, where it becomes continuous with the sigmoid colon. The descending colon extends, or it takes origin from the last part of the transverse colon, and here this place is known as the left colic flexure, and from the left colic flexure the descending colon starts, and at the pelvic brim it turns into the right and continues to the sigmoid colon, and this is the descending colon. Okay. The peritoneum covers the front and sides, and it bends it to the posterior abdominal wall. So the descending colon is covered by peritoneum, by its front and its sides. Okay, now comes to the arterial supply, the venous supply of the descending colon. So arterial supply. The left colic and sigmoid branches of the inferior mesenteric artery supply oxygenated blood to the descending colon. The venous supply. So the veins correspond to the arteries and drain into the inferior mesenteric vein, like the arteries. So the left colic vein and sigmoid will continue with the left colic and the sigmoid arteries, and will then finally end at the inferior mesenteric vein. The lymph drainage. So the colic lymph nodes reach to the inferior mesenteric node. The nerve supply. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic pelvic splenic nerve through inferior mesenteric flexures. Okay, this were about the descending colon. Now it comes to the last part of the large intestine, which is the sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon begins where descending colon passes in front of the pelvic brim. So where the descending colon ends, And at the pelvic brim, the sigmoid colon starts. Sigmoid colon. And below it become continuous with the rectum at the level of S3. Here, the rectum is present at the level of S3. Sacrum vertebra third. Okay, it is completely surrounded by peritoneum. And the sigmoid colon is mobile up to certain extent, means it can move up to some extent, and it hangs down into the pelvic cavity in the form of a loop. It is attached to the posterior wall of the pelvic by a fan-shaped fold of peritoneum known as sigmoid mesocolon. Sigmoid mesocolon. The sigmoid colon is attached to the posterior wall of the pelvic by a fan-shaped fold of peritoneum known as sigmoid mesocolon. Rectum. So the final section or the final part of the large intestine is rectum, and the rectum terminating at the anus. What is anus? So anus is an opening at the end of the alimentary canal or the digestive tract through which the solid waste material leaves the body. Leave the body. These were all about the large intestine. Hope so you know the all parts of the large intestine, the arterial supply, the lymph drainage, the venous supply, and the nerve supply of all the parts of the large intestine. Thank you so much, and thank you for giving your precious time. Allah Hafiz.